I want to go in the second part of today's talk to the question of the broader context. And I want to make crystal clear, and I know this is a difficult concept. I want to make clear that American capitalism continues its decline. And more so than ever before, at least in my lifetime, the signs are all around us. And that too is going to determine what the problems are President Biden will face and what solutions will occur to him and will be possible or not as he struggles with it. But I want to go through just some of the indicators of decline, which are at the same time signs of the growing problems Mr. Biden faces. Problems which, if he wants to solve them, he'll have to go much further towards Mr. Roosevelt than he has dared to do. And likewise, problems which, if he doesn't solve them, if he doesn't go toward Mr. Roosevelt, will pave the way for another oscillation as his efforts to mollify and to tax corporations and the rich at least a bit to do that don't have the apparent desired effect. Then they'll go back and try the more repressive Republican method, because that's how American politics works. So it's very important to understand this decline because of the stark either-or it is imposing on whoever sits in the White House. Okay, I'm going to start and go through some facts, some statistics, but to make a basic point, let's call this signs of U.S. capitalism's decline. At the beginning of Mr. Trump's presidency, foreign central banks, every other country has a bank in charge of keeping its currency reasonably stable, making its economy work, and thereby securing its people's food, clothing, and shelter. Every country has a central bank, and the central bank keeps reserves to back up its currency, that people will buy and sell in that country's currency, because if they have to, they can cash in that country's currency for one of the world's great currency that is safe. The US dollar used to be basically the world's reserve currency. Every bank kept dollars. Well, let's now see. When Mr. Trump becomes president, other countries were keeping 65% of their reserves in US dollars. That's already down from what it was, but it's still sizable. But in the 4 years that Mr. Trump was president, during which he proclaimed America first 3 or 4 times an hour, and how everything he was doing was bring the United States back, during that time, the percentage of reserves in foreign central banks held in the form of dollars shrank every year. It's now 59%, dropped 6 points from 65 to 59 just across the Trump presidency. That was the reality of a declining U.S. footprint in the world's economy. The rhetoric from Trump was the opposite. The promise of a dramatic recovery from Mr. Biden is the opposite. But that is the reality. Second index, COVID-19. 100 ways to say it, I'm just going to do one. The United States has 4% of the world's population and accounts for 20% of the world's deaths from COVID. One of the richest countries in the world, U.S. One of the countries with the most developed medical care system, U.S. could not get its wealth or its medical system around the problem. That's not a failure of doctors. That's not a failure of medication. That's a failure of the system to be able to mobilize the resources and the people to defeat a disease. Many other countries, much poorer than the United States, with much less developed medical care systems, did much better. Sure, some of them were communist countries, socialist countries, People's Republic of China, perhaps the most dramatic, but also Taiwan, which is quite different. Vietnam and Cuba did very well, but then again, so did New Zealand, and so did a whole bunch of other countries. This is a failure of a system, and we have to see and understand what it means that American capitalism could not protect the public health of the United States as well as so many other countries could and did. Inequality. The inequality of the United States was a contributor to the breakdown of our economy. In its way, it was also a contributor to our vulnerability to COVID. But even more amazing is that during the last 16 months, when our political leaders told us over and over again, we're all in this pandemic together, we must all work together to be safe, to take care of each other, to get the proper testing, to get the proper mask wearing and the social distancing and all the rest. We're all in it together. Here's the reality. As I pointed out, more than half, 82 million out of 160 million, more than half of the American working class suffered unemployment, an extreme economic cost. And at the same time that more than half of the workers suffered unemployment, the 650 billionaires that the United States has, the 650 richest people, saw their combined wealth go up just shy of $1 trillion. Or to say it in simple English, the rich got richer and everybody else didn't. What kind of a system would organize its national response to a disease that threatens everyone by managing to make serious inequality even worse? That's a system that is stretching its tolerance. The mass of people will not continue to allow this. It's not a question of whether they won't, it's just a question of when. Here's another signal. The United States cannot get its allies to do what it wants. Its position as the dominant capitalist power, which really starts with the end of World War II, when all the competitor, potential and actual, were destroyed. The Japanese, the Germans, the British, the French, whoever, the Russians, they had been decimated by the war, not the United States. Other than Pearl Harbor, no bomb fell on the United States. The number of Americans killed, small fraction of what many of these other countries suffered. But here are two examples of how the world is changing. Germany's industry needs energy. They have given up nuclear energy. They're the first major economy in the world to close its nuclear power plants and say, we will not be reliant on nuclear energy. We will not allow any of it. It's too dangerous for the human race. Remarkable. And that makes them dependent on oil and gas and so forth. And they made a deal with the Russians, who have enormous reserves of gas, to build a pipeline, the northern part of Europe, to bring the gas from Russia to Germany. The United States does not like it because it'll make the Germans dependent in a key way upon the Russians, and that may lead to all kind of collaboration and cooperation between these two. The Russians need the income from selling the gas, and the Germans need the energy from consuming the gas. The United States said no, and the Germans said, sorry, we're not closing this deal with Russia. We're going to continue and finish it. The United States jumped up and down, yelled, threatened to sanction any company that participated in laying the pipes. It made no difference. The Germans said, you can do whatever you want. We're doing this. Go away. The second example is literally a few days old. The United States has not exported hardly any of the vaccines it has produced. In contrast, the Europeans are major global exporters of vaccine. So guess what? When the pressure has arisen, which it has all over the world, about the unspeakably unjust and immoral behavior of the rich countries of the world in not sharing vaccines with the poor, let me just give you one statistic from the New York Times in early May. In rich countries, 1 out of 4 people has been vaccinated as of mid-April. In poor countries, 1 out of 500. Wow. Turns out if you're poor, you're going to die. You're going to get sick. Whatever the morality is any of us endorses, doesn't make room for that, as far as I know. So a cry has been raised by the United Nations and by the vast majority of the world's countries. Share the information. Give us the formulas so that we can make a vaccine. Temporarily suspend your patent protection, because companies like Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca that make vaccines have the formula. They have a patent. Patents mean you can't use the formula unless they give you permission, and you can pay them whatever they demand. They don't want it because they want to make a lot of money off of these vaccines. So at first the United States said, okay, well, we don't, but you need to give the private enterprise a mumble. But the pressure was too much, and Mr. Biden changed. He will allow a suspension of the patent on vaccines. The Europeans say, oh, no. You're only doing that because you don't export your vaccines. You don't have an external market that's important, so you don't mind sharing the vaccine because you can still control your own market, which is overwhelmingly served by your companies. No other vaccine in this country so far significant other than American produced. The Europeans are not in that situation. They don't want to share. They want their exports to provide the vaccine. They have a disagreement. They have a conflict, and they're not going to budge. And they've told Mr. Biden, the power, the influence of the United States, not what it was in the past. Then there's the matter of 3 wars. Americans don't see their own participation in wars the way other countries do. So let me tell you how the vast preponderance of foreign newspapers, radio, television view the following 3 wars that the United States has been engaged in: Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. Those are considered in the rest of the world defeats of the United States. It went in with a set of objectives it could not achieve, and it left before it had achieved those objectives. Therefore, it is a defeat. Americans can't handle this. I won't belabor it, but I would like you to understand that when Mr. Biden says everybody's coming out of Afghanistan in September, no conditions, that to the rest of the world, this is a defeat. And it's a sign of a society that cannot continue to do the kinds of things it thought it could, and maybe once it could, but in decline, it cannot. Next item. we have not been able to overcome the economic cycles that beset U.S. capitalism, and indeed capitalism everywhere in the world. Every 4 to 7 years, the cycles are upon us. The downturn happens, the recession, the depression, the crash, the bust, whatever you want to call it. Here we are in the 21st century, 20 years into it. We had the dot-com crisis of 2000, the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, and the so-called COVID crisis that we're in now. 20 years, 3 crises, average 7, right on time. A successful economic system like capitalism could have, would have, should have, and tried to overcome its cycles. Even giving them a name like .com or subprime mortgage or COVID is an attempt to suggest that the crash isn't the problem of capitalism, but of these other things, mortgages, .com prices on the market shares, or a disease. It isn't. This average of every 4 to 7 years has happened with or without viruses, with or without mortgage failures, with or without booming prices on stock markets. It's a dodge. It's a desire not to face the fact that this system cannot exist without these periodic collapses that cause so much pain, suffering, and tension. I've left for last, because it's another subject, and we don't have time, the fact that the United States, for the first time really in a century, has a major, powerful, global competitor. There is no way around this, even as American commentators try their damnedest to find some way not to face this. The People's Republic of China is an extraordinary economic experiment. A powerful Communist Party sits at the top. It's making the basic economic strategic decisions. Under it, controlled by it, partly a private capitalist enterprise sector, part Chinese, part not. And next to that, a big, powerful sector of state-owned and operated enterprises. A mixed system, partly capitalist, partly not, in the conventional sense. All of the enterprises are organized with employers and employees. Some employers are private, some employers are state. Whatever you want to call that system, here's what it has achieved over the last quarter century. For the 25 years, on average, the United States GDP, output of goods and services, grew 2 to 3%. Over the same period of time, the total output of goods and services in China grew 6 to 9%. In other words, 2 to 3 times faster. Over the last 25 years, real wages in the United States stagnant. They're roughly today what they were, growing maybe on average 0.5% a year, virtually nothing. Over the same 25 years, the average real wage in China quadrupled. There's no parallel here. There's nothing close here. These are wildly diverging performances. And what I'm saying has nothing to do with endorsing, supporting, criticizing, or not criticizing China. They have their strengths, they have their weaknesses. But when it comes to a powerful capitalist competitor of the United States, China is it. And that changes everything. When you put all this together, you have a declining U.S. capitalism, confronting a crisis, partly a pandemic, partly your typical business cycle crash. These are very serious situations, not easily repaired. It is extremely unlikely that the modest steps taken by Mr. Biden, even though they're dramatically better than what Mr. Trump did, and even though they conform to the typical Republican-Democratic difference, it is extremely unlikely that the extraordinary difficulties of the declining American capitalism can be handled, managed by the modesty of what Mr. Biden has done. So either the progressives in the Democratic Party and outside it push much, much harder in the direction of becoming like the CIO, Socialist and Communist coalition of the 30s, and or the situation deteriorates really quickly. One or the other or both of those things have to happen if there's even going to be a chance that Mr. Biden rises to the historical level that FDR achieved, and I've gone over what the limits of that as well are. So the prognosis here is not good, and I would not be useful to you, nor honest, if I pretended otherwise. But I will say this, and I believe it 100%. Every crisis is also an opportunity. This crisis of capitalism and of the Democratic Party and of the way the United States has handled or not handled its problems is also an opportunity to make the kinds of changes that can solve our problems so we don't kick them down the road again. So we don't do what's necessary, but leave in place the people who can and will undo what we can achieve. Let's learn those lessons. Let's not have a minority running our economic system and taking us back when they're not happy with having to pay some of the costs of the system they sit at the top of. A change in the organization of our enterprises so there aren't a tiny minority sitting at the top. As you know, we advocate for worker co-ops as the substitution for hierarchical capitalist enterprises. They might form the basis of a different way of organizing the economy so it doesn't continuously put us in the kinds of dead ends that Roosevelt faced, that Biden faced, and that now has reached levels and proportions that confront this society with an accumulation of problems it cannot solve. It is a time for radical thinking, radical action, and radical change, not because of some abstract commitment, but because of the practical realities that have brought us to a point where no other solutions make sense. Thank you very much for your interest. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to the next lecture 2 months from now, the evening of the second Wednesday of the month of July. Thank you, and have a very good evening. And remember, if you can be supportive, go to our website, democracyatwork.info. Thank you, and good night.